What more can truly be said about Britain? It is the land of faded dreams, a potential unreached. But despite all this, all the pitfalls and missteps, it still stands before us at the crossroads of history. But before we can guess what's ahead, we must first look how we got here. Looking back now, the 7 Years' War may seem like a daze. It's talked about in the halls of Westminster, blamed by the Bradford government and all previous British administrations for all of the woes the nation is facing. It is still the pride accomplishment of the French, and is still the national black spot of the British, even 50 years later. It has become a slogan, a phrase used by politicians of all sorts so much that it has almost lost all meaning. Because of this, it's necessary to emphasize the sheer scale of what it truly was, a disaster. The British government in the lead-up to the war could be described with one word: pride. They weren't arrogant like the French. They didn't think that they were invincible. They knew they were the underdogs, but they believed that they, on an almost spiritual level, were destined for greatness. They did have some reason for this. Their navy was the largest in the world, and their ally, the Prussians, struck the same balance of size and eliteness on land as the British did on sea. So when war in Europe broke out, the British government made the fateful choice to take the world head on. The plan was simple. They appeared the underdogs on the surface, but in reality had many key strengths that the French did not. While on paper, the war was the British and Prussians against France, Austria, Russia, and Spain, a much larger alliance, the British realized that for their purposes, all that mattered was the war against the French. If they could divide French attention between Europe and America, the larger size of the French army wouldn't matter. The British colonies were in a much stronger position, and if the war dragged on long enough, the French would inevitably lose Quebec, even if they moved in more troops later down the line. In addition to this, the British Navy is both larger and more sustainable than the French. If they could either beat them decisively early on, or make the war drag on endlessly, they too would win. It seemed perfect, and they went in with a confidence and zeal that seemed unshakable. They deemed a decisive confrontation too risky at first, so instead played the long game, waiting for the French to slowly crumble. The British initially lost the first few fights, all according to plan of course. The French would eventually tire themselves fighting Prussia, and the Navy would cut off supplies to Quebec. However, they faced much larger resistance than seemed possible, and kept losing. It gradually became clear that the French had anticipated their plan, and matched the British 1-for-1. They had essentially withdrawn entirely from the war against Prussia, abandoning their Austrian allies but ensuring the protection of Quebec. This threw a wrench in things. The French Navy took the brunt of British attacks, and while they steadily lost more ships than the British, they held enough to keep supplies flowing. The army, on the other hand, turned the St. Lawrence into a fortified bastion, preventing any British advance. The British now had to fight the superior French army head-on, taking major losses. Gradually, the front stalled, and no side moved past the St. Lawrence. The war became more and more expensive, and to keep up with it, the British government demanded harsher and harsher taxes from both America and Ireland. Ireland faced the brunt of this, with widespread confiscation of land, ships, or anything that could be used to fill the British treasury. A gradual famine spread across the land, as all the food being produced was sent back to England to stop discontent there. This provided a temporary, though unsustainable, source of revenue for the British to keep fighting. But despite all this, in the halls of Westminster, a divide began to grow. The Prime Minister William Pitt proposed a continuation of the long-term plan, whittling down the French over years. This meant increasingly fierce opposition by the Conservative Whigs, led by Lord North. They instead wanted decisive confrontation, the deployment of more troops to the colonies, and even an attack on France itself. This divide in strategy turned into a political one as well, with the Whig hegemony over Parliament getting weaker and weaker as Conservative Whigs questioned the Prime Minister himself. As the month went on, this debate turned from an auxiliary issue to the core of British politics. The people were getting tired, and the government was divided on how to put an end to the French stalemate. William Pitt, seeking a compromise, resigned as Prime Minister in favor of a candidate more agreeable to both sides. The Duke of Grafton took the post, but found himself in the same situation as Pitt before. Would they attack now and risk everything, or wait and be ensured of victory but at a heavy cost? Ultimately, they wouldn't get either chance. On a fateful April day, news reached London of a true disaster, an Irish army at the gates of Dublin. In their pride, they were completely blindsided by the idea that the mistreatment of their subjects would eventually catch up to them. They scrambled to respond, and while the British army destroyed the organized Irish rebels, guerrilla forces ravaged the countryside. The French jumped at the opportunity, supplying the rebels with an endless amount of guns and weaponry. It seemed that no matter where the British army went, the Irish rebels were one step ahead of them. The British were livid, outraged at the idea that the Irish Catholics would dare oppose them. As the war dragged on and as losses to the French grew, the British took out their anger on the Irish. They burned down any villages harboring rebels, summarily executed anyone associated with the Catholic Front, and branded anyone asking for a resolution as French traitors. But despite all of this, the rebels held. The British then became stuck in a vicious cycle. They'd send troops into the Americas, beat back the Irish, then only watch as the French advanced in North America. Then they'd send troops back to fight the French, only for the Irish rebels to reappear and begin their campaign once more. It gradually became clear the disaster that had just happened. A new front had been opened, and with it the secret flaw in the British plan was revealed. In a grand irony, their plan to divide the French in two ended with them being divided in two. They could have won in the short term, they could still win in the very long term, but they could not hold out in the interim, surrounded by all sides. After enough time, it became clear that the Irish issue would not go away, and that the future of the United Kingdom itself would be put in jeopardy if they managed to somehow break away. So the British, though hesitant, sought peace with France. In London, the British delegation met with their enemy that they knew they could beat eventually, but certainly not now. In a painfully humiliating ceremony, the British agreed to withdraw from the Hudson Bay in India, with the condition that the French immediately stop any assistance to the Irish rebels. The French agreed, and then immediately proceeded to kick the British while they were down. The French, in their arrogance, thought themselves invincible, finally beating their old enemy one-on-one. As such, they did not stop aiding Ireland, and in fact doubled their efforts in a ridiculous show that risked reigniting the war that had just ended. Nearly 4 months after the Treaty of London, the Channel crisis was in full swing. The French were flagrantly and belligerently violating the Treaty of London, supplying Irish rebel groups and openly moving naval vessels to the North Atlantic. The British gave an ultimatum, giving the French 3 months to cease all activity or there would be another war. The British fleet still outnumbered the French, and it was doubtful that the French would be so lucky again if forced into another protracted conflict. The prideful Bourbons, however, refused to budge, and marched recklessly into another war. What saved the French was ultimately what doomed the British: the shocking news of an insurrection in the 13 colonies. It was only now that the British truly recognized the scale of their problems. Slowly but steadily, over the course of 7 years, their empire had fallen to pieces. The British political system was fractured, and as any hope of either Ireland or America being secured faded, the internal divisions erupted into full-on sectarian clashes. As the dust settled, both Ireland and America were free, and the Whig hegemony which had lasted since the English Civil War was shattered. Lord North stood as the Prime Minister, leading a new conservative order made up of the bitter and resentful aristocracy, which had up to this point been kept docile by the merchant elite which previously brought Britain briefly to the forefront of the world. The liberalism which defined Britain up to now was replaced with a hostility to change and obsession with what was lost. The Tories had achieved their seemingly hopeless dream of ruling Britain once more, but what they ruled is a land that is a shadow of its former self. As the new international order settled in, the United Kingdom gradually became isolationist and distant, hostile to all the powers in Europe out of a deep-seated distrust which would never truly fade. Their eternal enemies lay victorious, and every time the French boasted about their success, the hatred grew even deeper. This distrust extended also to their old allies, the Prussians. Despite being on the losing side as well, Prussia seemed to avoid Britain's fate. In fact, it had grown considerably, becoming the cornerstone of Central Europe. France's strategy of abandoning the European front had brought ruin to Britain, but glory to Prussia. Free to rampage against the Austrians, Prussians gained land in the war which brought Britain to its knees. For this, the British resented Prussia almost as much as their enemies, and scorned any new alliance in a misplaced attempt to spite those who wronged them. With this, Britain lay dormant. The Tory government spent the 20 years after the war slowly recovering, building up the navy but unable to use it. However, as the new century arrived, the United Kingdom attempted to stand once more in the light. They would try, once more, to assert themselves on the international stage. Whether that would bring ruin or glory remains to be seen.